Alright, so today I wanted to share something that I've noticed in the ball python industry here in 2020, and it seems like the prices of ball pythons are actually increasing, which is kind of unusual. I've been in ball pythons for about 5 years, and usually if you actually look at the market and what things are selling for over a few years, you kind of get in your mind what a certain gene or a combination should sell for. And this year a lot of them are significantly higher, and some of them are actually double what I would expect. It's kind of crazy. And when it comes to pricing on ball pythons, I think it really comes down to supply and demand. And for some reason, it seems like the demand is really high this year for ball pythons. And I think there is maybe a combination of factors. I think partly it's due to social media. There's a lot of channels here on YouTube that have been doing, reviews on ball pythons, a lot of really cool ball python content on a lot of small channels that have been really gaining some traction this year. I know my channel's been doing pretty good this year, gaining some traction. I've actually started my channel pretty much the same time as multiple other people started, and it seems like we're all really kind of promoting the love of ball pythons, how awesome they can really be. Like Bobby here around my neck, he is a bamboo ball python, really super mellow, probably the tamest ball python that I've ever seen. A lot of people see Bobby and they're like, hey, I want a ball python too. So I think partly it's because of the influence of social media really starting to gain traction, and I think it could be also from the pandemic. A lot of people maybe have lost their jobs, or they're afraid of losing their jobs, maybe looking for another source of income, thinking about breeding ball pythons, which is kind of interesting. I don't know exactly if there's anything else going on besides those two things, but it seems like the demand is really high. I've seen a lot of these really big breeders, they come on YouTube and they're like, I don't know what's going on this year, but you guys are buying some ball pythons like crazy. As a matter of fact, I've actually been posting some snakes on Morphmarket. In my last batch of snakes, I actually posted, I think, like a dozen snakes, and within 12 hours, all those snakes sold super fast. It was pretty crazy, and I actually priced them a little bit higher than last year. So, when the supply dries up, people can, demand a little bit more of a price for their ball pythons because they kind of corner the market. And when it comes to pricing, it's a little bit tricky because some stuff comes down, especially if it's really high, but usually it kind of plateaus out and it's kind of remains stable over the long haul. So what I'm gonna do is I actually want to jump over the internet and I want to show you some of the pricing on the ball pythons. It can be a little bit tricky as far as just a kind of a blanket statement that all the ball pythons are actually increasing in price. Some of them are coming down, but I'd say some of the stuff that you think would be stable is actually coming up in price quite a bit, which is pretty amazing. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on morphmarket.com, and I want to start with kind of the exception to the rule that all ball pythons are actually increasing in price, and it really comes down to supply and demand. And usually when something brand new comes out, you have a limited supply and sometimes you have an incredible demand, and the prices can be incredibly high for some of this stuff. And as you produce more and more of them, the prices come down to where, eventually years and years later, it kind of flattens out and you get kind of this equilibrium between the supply and the demand. But usually the stuff that's still coming down in price, sometimes it's really coming down really fast, and those are the new genes on the market that people are producing a lot of, and it kind of floods the market. The more you flood the market, the more the prices can really come down. And this is kind of one of the examples that I saw right from the beginning. 5 years ago, these were selling for an incredible amount of money. This is actually a scaleless head ball python, and the scaleless head has just a few scales missing from the top of the head. If you actually breed two of them together, you get a completely scaleless ball python. And take a look at this. This is one of the first ones I saw. As a matter of fact, I think this is the very first ball python that I ever really was aware of. Looking over here at Morphmarket, I was actually at work in a chemistry lab in the lunchroom, and someone came up to me and showed me this on the phone. They say, hey, take a look at this snake. And I was like, wow, that is something. It's a scaleless head. And the thing that really surprised me, take a look at this. This was the price, $45,000 for a scaleless head, and it was pretty incredible. Actually, this one posted, I actually saw some of these where they would post and then like a week later they would sell for $45,000. I was like, what in the world is going on in ball pythons? I had no clue about genes or snakes or anything like that, and that is really kind of what piqued my curiosity, some of these. And this was back in 2014. and it was kind of amazing. It seemed like this was so popular, the scaleless head, that so many people are into it. You can actually take a scaleless head, breed it to something else, half the offspring would come out as scaleless head. And it got to the point where just a couple years later, I'd actually go to some of the reptile shows, and every snake in everyone's display case was all scaleless head with multiple genes in the mix. People were producing a lot of them, making a lot of money off the scaleless head, but the problem is they really flooded the market and it really crashed super hard. And here we are 6 years later. Take a look at what a scaleless head sells for. I actually pulled this one up. This is a scaleless head, just a regular scaleless head with no other genes in the mix. I actually pulled this one up. This one is selling for $400. Went from $45,000 all the way down to $400. So that is kind of the risk of getting into something that is really super popular. Everybody wants to get into the project and it's really expensive. Sometimes they can actually come down in price to pretty much where we're at today, where it just kind of flattens out and it pretty much can't go much lower than just a couple $100 for some of these genes. It's kind of amazing. So sometimes if you actually have a recessive, it can hold its price for a long time. Sometimes, you know, 10 years or longer, because it's like with the scaleless head, you can breed it through your collection and produce a whole bunch of them, versus if you have something that's recessive, especially if you have a gene that's not very popular. And kind of the hard thing with this is it was really easy to produce and everybody wanted to get into the project to make the completely scaleless ball python, and that between those two factors, that's why the prices really crashed. So if you actually make the completely scaleless, if you're wondering what that looks like, this is I actually have some scaleless heads in my collection, and I'm actually trying to produce one of these. This is a snake with no scales at all. You breed two scaleless heads together, 25% of the time you get a snake with no scales. It's kind of weird. It almost has like these wrinkles in it. And there's other snakes, like I've actually seen some corn snakes and there's different snakes that have been scaleless for a long time, but the scaleless heads in ball python and the completely scaleless have only been out just in the last few years. Pretty amazing gene. So take a look at this one. This is kind of interesting. This is an all-white snake, a blue-eyed leucistic, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to make an all-white snake. This is pretty much the ideal way you can make it with the combination of the lesser and the Mojave. And if you actually go back in the last pretty much like the 4 or 5 years before this year, I was going through all the different prices for blue-eyed leucistics, and I think the average price was about $300 or $350. So every time I saw a blue-eyed leucistic, it's like, all right, you know, I'm expecting to pay about $300 or $350. As a matter of fact, I actually pulled this one up. This was from 2019, just last year. It sold for $350. And for whatever reason, it seems like the supply of the blue-eyed leucistics is really drying up, and people have almost doubled the prices, which is pretty incredible. I actually pulled this one over here. This is another blue-eyed leucistic lesser Mojave that sold this year, and take a look at the price on this one. This actually sold for $650. And it's kind of interesting if you're breeding ball pythons and you're not used to really watching the prices really close, you can kind of be tricked into kind of posting your snake over here for the same price that you've always posted it for the last few years. But let me tell you, this year I would definitely pay attention to the pricing. If you put snakes over here on Morphmarket and you list them for like $300 for a blue-eyed leucistic, they'll probably sell in a few hours. It is pretty crazy. So you really have to watch the prices. And every time I sell a snake, I always come over here to Morphmarket, and there's always a range, like a low range and a high range. And a lot of times the new breeders, what they'll do is they'll look at the cheapest one and they'll try to undercut it. Like if you actually see one for $300, some people will post like for $250 or something like that. The problem is if you actually posted a blue-eyed leucistic for $250, it would probably sell super quick, and within a matter of a couple days, you're pretty much left with all the ones for like $600, which is kind of weird, the whole supply and demand thing. As a matter of fact, I actually pulled up two other things over here. Take a look at this. This is all the snakes that have been listed over here on Morphmarket Morphmarket, all the ones that have sold and all the ones for sale. And I can't believe this number. This is pretty incredible. There's been 173,000 ball pythons over here on Morphmarket. And this is just in the United States. There's also, I think there's a UK version, and then South Africa. There's different localities. This is just in the United States. And I remember when I started like 5 years ago, this was like, I was kind of blown away back then. I think it was only like 30,000 snakes, and that number blew me away. And I remember a couple years ago when it actually passed 100,000, and now we're coming up on almost 200,000 ball pythons over here on Morphmarket. It's pretty incredible. So these are all the ones that have sold and are for sale. And if you actually resort by just the ones that are for sale, take a look at this. We're down to only 20,000 ball pythons for sale. And I've actually been watching this number usually kind of like right where we're at right now, kind of, you know, going into the fall. And usually in the fall, we have anywhere from like 40 or 50,000 ball python hatchlings for sale. So this is like, the number is like half, which is pretty incredible. So it seems like a lot of people are buying a lot of ball pythons. There's not as many over here on Morphmarket, although 20,000, that is a big number. But if you actually think about kind of the supply and the demand, and as a matter of fact, someone was actually asking me, hey, do you think the ball python market could ever be saturated? Which is an interesting question. And if you actually sit down and look at all the almost 200 genes in ball pythons and do the calculations as far as like single genes, the like double genes, and like just the few multiple gene combinations, there's literally millions of different combinations that you can make with just a few genes with ball pythons. It's pretty amazing. So, you know, with new genes coming out every year and all the different combinations and the ability to actually breed out all the individual genes in their pure form, I don't think that you could ever really saturate the ball python market. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Bill Smith asks, has anyone ever done studies on incubation temperature and deformities in ball pythons? And that is a very good question. So when it comes to adjusting the incubation conditions to force deformities in your ball python eggs, I don't think it would actually be an ethical study. I don't think you can actually design a scientific study to actually look at that in detail. Although I can share some of my observations as far as incubating ball pythons, some of the mistakes that I've made along the way. I actually have a 6 foot tall incubator that I made. It's a homemade incubator that I made out of a beverage cooler. And I actually have a fan in there that circulates the air, trying to get more of an even distribution of the heat from the top to the bottom. And there's always a slight differential of heat that's a couple degrees warmer on the top of the incubator versus the bottom of the incubator. And what I've actually found is the eggs that are on the top shelf of the incubator seem to hatch a little bit sooner, sometimes a couple days sooner than the eggs on the bottom compared to the expected hatch of like 60 days. Usually incubate about 90 degrees. Sometimes if you're a couple degrees above that, you'll hatch a couple days sooner. A couple degrees below that, you'll hatch a little bit later. But I haven't actually seen any deformities as far as the slight variation in temperature. Although one year I actually had my incubator actually malfunctioned. I was kind of freaking out at the time. I actually lost power to some of the components of my incubator, and at the time I had the whole thing full of, I think it was like 60 ball python eggs. And let me tell you, I was devastated. I was freaking out. I actually had the incubator in my basement, and usually it incubates about 90 degrees, and actually went way down. I think it was like in the low 70s or upper 60s, 60-degree Fahrenheit for like 3 days before I actually caught it. It was kind of terrifying. I actually have a bunch of alarms on there now. I definitely don't let it get out of control anymore, but that kind of freaked me out. And kind of the weird thing about that is those eggs still hatched. It seemed like most of them hatched like 3 or 4, sometimes it was like 5 days later on some of those eggs that they hatched really late because it got really cold. I didn't have any deformities in any of those, and they all hatched, which was such a relief. I thought for sure the whole year was going to be a bust. And kind of the interesting thing, a lot of people say you really can't force the gender of a ball python offspring by adjusting the incubation temperature. And I know in some lizards, if you increase or decrease the temperature, you can force all males or all females, which is kind of interesting. And kind of the weird thing is when my incubator malfunctioned and it got really cold, it seemed like I had a really high percentage of females. It seemed like almost every snake that I actually hatched out of the incubator was pretty much all females. I had very few males. I don't know if it was just kind of a random random anomalies. Sometimes the statistics can kind of play tricks on you. And sometimes, you know, a lot of people say that you can't adjust it and force the males or the females, but it would be worth kind of looking into that to see if you could really reduce the temperature and maybe force the higher percentage of females, which if you actually could would be kind of interesting, because a lot of people, seems like more people are looking for females versus the males. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.